Tonight on Primetime Politics, moving ahead with C5.
This bill enjoys incredibly broad support, and we're pleased to be making progress on it.
The Carney government is making concerted moves to get its One Canadian Economy bill through Parliament all before Canada Day. But the Assembly of First Nations is pushing back.
Having First Nations at the table there, that's a non-starter.
Coming up, AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak will find out why she describes the Liberal bill as Trump-like policy. Also,
I have ideas as to what to do, but I haven't made a final. I like to make the final decision 1 second before it's due.
the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Will the United States now join the fight? We will speak to a former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Plus, President Zelenskyy and the G7 in Kananaskis. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Prime Minister Carney's plan to get Bill C5 through Parliament is getting some major pushback. On Monday, Liberals passed a motion invoking closure on the bill, which means study and debate would be accomplished in 5 sitting days and over by the weekend. Now, the bill itself is titled the One Canadian Economy and is divided into 2 parts. The first is called the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act. It would remove federal barriers to internal trade within Canada, and it would also recognize provincial and territorial licenses and certifications for workers to work in federal jurisdictions. Now, the second part is called the Building Canada Act, which looks to speed up major projects in the national interest like highways, ports, and pipelines.
We ran an election campaign on themes associated with getting the country's economy moving, with lowering interprovincial trade barriers, with giving ourselves the tools to build nation-building projects, create jobs. It has broad support across the country from premiers, as you well know, from unions who have been very vocal, from investors in the business community. This bill enjoys incredibly broad support, and we're pleased to be making progress on it.
Still, there are those who are concerned about how this bill is making its way through Parliament. The Assembly of First Nations is among them, and earlier today I did speak with the AFN's National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak. I want to begin with your testimony that you gave to the Senate this week, because you gave it to the Committee of the Whole. You were speaking out against Bill C5, and in that testimony you described it as Trump-like policy. What do you mean by that?
Look, I just think that the way that this, the way that they're rolling out this bill and doing it within 7 days, I think that that's Trump-like. That's Trump. That's not the Canadian way. That's the way Trump would do things. And I think that we should be better than that. We should be respecting Canadians by hearing more diversity and more voices within committee. We should be also, hearing from First Nations. And, there's been no space. We've submitted a list with a whole bunch of speakers, and I don't know if they've gotten an invite. I haven't seen any indication that they have, and unfortunately I've had to lobby for a spot just to speak. So very disappointed that First Nations rights holders are being shut out of this process. We saw that at committees this week, like I said, that's a Trump way. That's not a Canadian way.
Except, when you look at this bill, once adopted, it does set out a consultation process through what they call an Indigenous Advisory Council. How is that not sufficient? I hear what you're saying. You want to have a voice at the table, but doesn't this bill actually lay out a voice or a process to have a voice in everything? Well,
an advisory group of people, for the government to think that that's sufficient, and then they appoint these people, are they rights holders, and are they going to be, lots to discuss about that. We don't even know, right? We haven't been told what this advisory body looks like, but for the government to think that that's consultation, that's insufficient.
Okay, insufficient. Although, I want to note the fact that we did hear from the Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations, Rebecca Alty, appearing before the Senate yesterday. Take a listen to what we heard from the Minister.
This legislation is about supporting projects that are not only shovel-ready, but shovel-worthy. Projects that respect Indigenous knowledge and uphold Aboriginal and treaty rights. We'll be looking for projects that have Indigenous support and, even better, Indigenous equity in the project.
So again, that's the Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations. Do you not believe the government, or do you think the government is lying when they say that they're out to fight for the interests and advancement of Indigenous communities? Well,
look, I think that the fact is many First Nations across this country, and I'm going to say right off the bat, First Nations are not, they want prosperity as well, but not if you're going to trample on their rights. And so far, what we've seen from Canada's history, and I know that we're a young country and we're coming together and we have a relationship and First Nations people are the only people that are legislated throughout the entire world. First Nations people in this country, Métis people aren't, Inuit aren't, we're a very distinct group. And at the same time, the past 150, 200 years since the creation of this 100 and whatever Canada is, we haven't been treated well. We've had to go through residential schools, day schools, the 60s scoop, and now it's 2025. Some of our kids don't even have access to high-speed internet. So I know that this country wants to ram through this bill. They want to get to resources right around First Nations communities across this country. But how can First Nations, I had a community in this morning, they still don't have drinking water. I had another community in yesterday, and they were like, we need housing. So closing Canada's First Nations infrastructure gap, I think that should be a national priority. And let's have those conversations. They're not easy to have a conversation. I'm sure many First Nations have projects that they want to proceed with. Others are absolutely opposed. But we haven't had the time to A, analyze this bill properly, B, have people, First Nations people, even present in committees. And I think that's what I meant when I say the Trump way. Let's not be like that in this country. I think we could do better, and I think by working together and being at the same table, whether we debate or not, it's going to make it stronger. But I think shutting people voices down that wanted to present this week is the wrong way to go.
Well, you mentioned the infrastructure gap, and you have here the minister talking about it's not going to be every project that's going to be approved through this bill. It's going to be those deemed of national interest, and national interest includes prosperity and advantages, to take the minister's arguments, for Indigenous communities. So if you're talking about infrastructure gap, there's also a lot of talk about shared ownership right now, so that could be cash resources for Indigenous communities that could address that gap. By opposing the bill, are you kind of worried you're cutting off the possibility of closing that gap by opposing the government on this?
Well, first of all, I'm not opposing the bill. I'm opposing the process. I don't have a mandate to say one way or another whether this bill is one way or another. We will be meeting with our chiefs in Assembly, and they will decide if they're giving AFN a position one way or another, whether it's for or against. And I've heard from from many chiefs, and some are for this bill and some are not. But I think the problem that the federal government is having by ramming this bill through is just that, right? Like, I think if they took the summer, split this bill off with some of their other pieces that they want to pass, split this bill off and gave it time to make it, maybe you're going to make it stronger and work through things rather than it being mirrored and, opposition litigation right off the bat. It doesn't have to be like this. Mm-hmm. We could be respectful to each other in this country, bring people to the table, open committees up for Canadians as well. I mean, I'm sure many of them want to speak on making our country the best place that it can be for all of our grandchildren someday, yours and mine. But at the same time, if we're ramming something through in 14 days, are we being reckless? And are we not looking the way that we should? We should be looking carefully and doing things in a careful, good way so that that our laws stand, and following, of course, the laws of this country. Follow your own processes and laws, and ramming a bill through the House of Commons and through the Senate is not the Canadian way. It's okay for us to debate, and we should celebrate those debates. They make us stronger.
Sorry to jump in because we're quickly running out of time, but I do then wonder, because the goal of the government here is to have C5 passed by Canada Day. If it does get passed by Canada Day, where does that leave you?
Well, it certainly, I think I look to the chiefs in Assembly, as we've always done, and the leadership across this country will decide what steps are next, and communities will decide what steps are next because they are the rights holders. But I can assure you, though, projects aren't going to move forward without the support of First Nations. And like I said, some First Nations are ready to go on certain issues. Sometimes you see really good projects moving ahead. I mean, I've seen one recently in another province. The Premier was there, and the First Nations people were there, industry was there. People were there, progressive and moving. But that's because they had that relationship and they talked about it right off the bat, not as an afterthought. And so when we create bills in Parliament and you don't have First Nations people helping to draft some of those issues, especially when it's this huge, a big bill like this, they should have made sure that they came to First Nations people, and we would have helped work through that with them. But it's disheartening when we're an afterthought, and even then, given 5 minutes to come and present on it, that's insufficient.
Well, I'm very glad you came to studio to speak to us about it today. Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, to Washington now, where the U.S. president says the United States may join Israel in the fight and bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, in the last 24 hours, both Israel and Iran launched a barrage of missiles against the other, with Israel targeting uranium enrichment sites. Donald Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender, and when asked today if he would order the U.S. military to join the Israeli effort, we'll take a listen to what Donald Trump had to say.
You don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble, and they want to negotiate. And I said, why didn't you negotiate with me before? All this death and destruction. Why didn't you negotiate with me 2 weeks ago? You could have done fine. You would have had a country.
Well, to talk about the situation, we are reaching out right now to Jon Allen from 2006 to 2010. He served as Canada's ambassador to Israel. These days, Mr. Allen, a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Jon Allen, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, full disclosure, we booked this time with you because the UN had planned to start talks today on a possible two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinian people. That's now been postponed because of what is happening with Iran right now. So let's begin there, if you don't mind, Jon, because when it comes to Iran, we now have the United States calling on Iran to essentially submit to a complete surrender. There's speculation right now as to whether or not the United States will get involved with Israel in some type of bombing campaign. What are your concerns at this moment in time when you look at the situation?
My concerns are that we have a president who is completely unpredictable and somebody that I don't particularly trust with taking major decisions. We have the possibility of a replay of what happened in Iraq, where people are suggesting that Iran was days away from having nuclear bombs when in fact they weren't, and we could be at the beginning of a war whose end is rather unpredictable. There's no question that Israel would like to either do away with or reduce significantly the nuclear weaponization possibilities of Iran, and probably most of the world is supportive of that. It's not clear whether they would also like to induce regime change. They would certainly want regime change, but whether their goals are also that, and whether the goals of the United States are that, is unclear. And it's not clear what would result if there was regime change. Would the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps take over? Would there be a fight for power in Iran? And of course, what happens in the region if there's a war? If all goes well, the United States enters, uses its buster blocking bombs, does away with Fordo. Iran says enough is enough. That's the good news scenario, and some kind of surrender and ceasefire is worked out. That's the easy way out, but it's not clear that that's the only option. So,
well, I'm sorry to interrupt. As you say, that would be the more positive scenario. But when you look at the more negative scenario, a wider regional conflict, what does that look like? Because I think a lot of people are concerned about that, but not knowing what form it would actually take.
Yeah, I don't think it's a wider regional conflict in the sense that there are going to be a lot of countries coming to defend Iran. That's not going to happen. The problem would be if Iran is sufficiently threatened, and if the regime is sufficiently threatened, that it decides to attack U.S. facilities in the region, embassies, military bases. If Iran decides to attack countries in the Gulf, for example, in the past they've hit Saudi Arabia's Aramco facilities. Is it possible they could shut down the Strait of Hormuz, through which significant amounts of oil pass, leading to skyrocketing oil prices, recession worldwide? These are the worst case scenarios. Mm-hmm. But those are the things that could happen. And of course, Iran could begin attacking Israeli or Jewish sites around the world with clandestine kinds of activities.
Mm-hmm. So a number of different scenarios that could play out. Now earlier this week, the G7 did meet in Kananaskis. On Monday, the leaders of the G7 called for a de-escalation in this conflict, and that included Donald Trump being okay with that statement. But what power does that kind of statement carry in this moment in time? Because I do wonder who is actually empowered to influence what is happening beyond Iran, Israel, and the United States in this moment?
Nobody. Those are the three players. Right now, with the United States being crucial, Israel continues to carry out its activities. Iran is trying to defend itself and sending fewer and fewer ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel. Right now, the question is, what is the United States going to do? Yes, the G6 can call for de-escalation and diplomatic solutions and offer to mediate, but the influence they have is minimal. Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, if he's listening to anybody, will only listen to Donald Trump. And I think the only two countries that can influence what Iran is doing are Israel and the United States.
So we watch to see what the next move is, in particular from Washington. But, before we're done, John, again, today was supposed to have been the start of a discussion at the UN about a possible two-state solution for Israel and for the Palestinian people. President Macron said that the postponement, and he helped organize this summit, he said the postponement was due to logistical constraints. He said this was not a political retreat. But I wonder, given what is happening in Iran and Israel right now, whether the Gaza and the Palestinian people are necessarily going to be forgotten as this carries out in a different part of the Middle East.
Well, they're certainly going to be forgotten to some extent while this war continues. There's no question about that. That's not to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu's problems in Gaza, the quagmire that he's in, and his problems at home are necessarily over. He may get a bump in popularity there for a while for what's happening in Iran, but at some point he's going to have to return to domestic politics and to the politics of the Palestinians. A significant number of Gazans were killed yesterday, once again in an effort to try and get food and other humanitarian assistance. Those actions, those deaths, and the destruction continue to make headlines, but the question of a two-state solution, which I consider to be an essential element of the region moving forward in stability and peace, is certainly going to be put on the back burner for the next little while.
Jon Allen, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Well, it was not the G7 the Ukrainian president was hoping for. Yes, Volodymyr Zelenskyy did secure a more than $4 billion deal with Canada, but he was not able to make Ukraine's case to the American president. Donald Trump leaving a day before Zelenskyy addressed the other G7 leaders. Well, for his thoughts on the G7 meeting and the situation in Ukraine, we're now joined by Ihor Michalchyshyn. He is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Ihor, thank you for coming to the studio.
Thanks for the invitation.
So listen, you know, obviously President Zelenskyy came to Canada hoping to make two things: an appeal for more aid, also an appeal for more sanctions against Russia. He didn't really get his chance to do that in front of all the leaders because Donald Trump left after the first day. What do you take from Mr. Trump's departure, given that it was the day before President Zelenskyy was to address the leaders, and also the concern that Donald Trump currently has with the situation in Ukraine?
Well, we met with President Zelenskyy in Calgary briefly. I think he was pleased with particularly Canada and Prime Minister Carney's actions. In terms of Trump, I mean, it's being widely reported that Ukraine was disappointed that they didn't have that face-to-face meeting, but I think he did have a significant meeting with many allies that are there at the G7. All of those countries individually have been supportive. We also have the NATO summit coming up next week, so we hope to see more from particularly European allies. I mean, I think with Trump, Trump didn't want to meet with Zelenskyy. I think Trump, found an excuse to leave early because he didn't want to talk about Ukraine. He has steadfastly refused to condemn Russia and has invented various narratives to justify in his own mind that, and so we're appalled that the Americans, every day there's civilians killed, and the Americans don't seem to be able to do anything about it with the Russians.
Well, and to that, Donald Trump, in his one of his first statements in Banff at Kananaskis, was essentially saying it's a shame Russia is not here, referencing the fact that the G7 used to be the G8. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's a terrible statement, and I think he was saying some things that were not true about who and how kind of kicked Russia out of the G8 at that point. So I think the consensus is there from the international community. The Americans are the odd man out on that consensus, and I think he removed himself from that equation because he didn't want to I think be surrounded by allies of his that are all kind of the same thought and the same action in helping Ukraine. I think it's very disappointing, that the American president, that the United States won't bring themselves to speak out, against violence being played out on civilians every day. And there was just an American killed in Ukraine last night, and silence from the White House.
Mm-hmm. Well, to that, I do want to read a part of what we heard from Prime Minister Carney, because this, in his closing statements as the chair of the conference, he said the following, quote, "G7 leaders expressed support for President Trump's efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. They recognize that Ukraine has committed to an unconditional ceasefire, and they agreed that Russia must do the same. G7 leaders are resolute in exploring all options to maximize pressure on Russia, including financial sanctions." So that is from Prime Minister Carney. I'm going to break that down because the opening line says that they are very much behind Donald Trump's effort to essentially get a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. Do you have any hope that a negotiated settlement is still possible?
Well, it's been more than a month, I believe, since Ukraine accepted the conditions that the United States had laid out and accepted a ceasefire. I think it was in Istanbul that there were these high-level meetings that President Putin didn't show up for. I think Ukraine must be hopeful and is hopeful that by playing along with the conditions that the Americans have set, that there would be some progress and there would be some reciprocal action and pressure on Russia to comply, and we've seen none of it, right? We've seen, in fact, President Putin made endless excuses why he couldn't be there. He has subsequently sort of spent time, mulling over every other potential issue besides explaining why he isn't willing to do it, and he's facing no consequences from the United States for it. So we like Ukraine, want a peace in Ukraine, but the peace isn't going to happen if Russia doesn't come to the table or isn't forced to the table.
Okay. Comes to the table, forced to the table. The leaders also talk about being open to additional measures, including financial sanctions against Russia. But, is that effective if the United States is not a part of those sanctions? Because it seems that is more a statement of the G6 rather than the G7.
I mean, I think coordinated international sanctions are effective as opposed to having no coordinated international sanctions. I think that the taking on the Russian oil tanker fleet, the shadow fleet as it's called, is something that can be done by those countries at the table that are willing to do it.
Which was referenced when the Prime Minister unveiled that multi-billion-dollar package.
We're matching what the EU has done, what the UK has done, which is good. Not doing that enables Russia to make even more revenue to fuel the war. So it is disappointing and I think tragic that the American government, the American leadership, president, won't join on to those and won't take any action seemingly to stand up to Putin or to punish him. He calls him his friend. He wants him at the table. It's a very bizarre turn of events in terms of what he said about helping Ukraine achieve peace and where things are now.
Mm-hmm. You also, not you, but your organization, in responding to what happened in Kananaskis, you also referenced the fact that you, as an organization, would like to see the Russian assets seized, be handed over to Ukraine to help fund its defense against Russia. Isn't that already happening in some degree?
It is happening to some degree. Right now, the interest, Ukraine is receiving loans off the interest of these frozen assets. We're now talking about the 300 billion that is mostly held in Euroclear in Belgium. That is the discussion of international note for the banking systems, for the legal scholars in terms of how do you seize sovereign state assets, and there's a path there, we believe, to do that, because the costs of the war escalate every day. You see the destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of lives, and the weapons that Ukraine needs to buy or be given to survive. And so we're seeing the only viable option there is for these Russian assets to be funneled away from Russia as a punishing, crippling move. There isn't going to be any way that Russia voluntarily agrees to this, and B, it will help Ukraine and the Ukrainian people survive now, and it will be a serious consequence for Russia.
Have you received any type of response to this call?
It's been a discussion in the legal community, in the academic community. There are many people around the world, Canadian parliamentarians as well, senators and MPs, that have been pushing this forward, and Canada's had some legislation that has been leading the way on it. But it is really an international discussion on what the international banking system is willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kananaskis is now over. We keep an eye now onto the NATO meeting that's about to take place. Ihor, thank you for the time. Thank you for
Thanks for the invitation.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.